He had children with his own grandmother, the sickest family scandal ever revealed in Mississippi. A phrase that chills the spine and stirs disbelief, but one that represents a dark reality buried deep in the swamps of Humphreys County during the turbulent 1960s. This was not folklore, not superstition, not the kind of tale whispered by old women on porches in the humid twilight. This was documented fact, sealed in hospital reports, police files, and social worker testimonies that decades later would surface to expose one of the most disturbing family tragedies in American history. The summer of 1962 was sweltering in the small community of Bellone, a place so small that everyone knew the name of the sheriff, the preacher, the shopkeeper, and the bus driver. It was the kind of town where gossip served as both entertainment and survival. But even here, where rumors were currency, the whispers about the Caldwell family carried a different weight, heavier, darker, and spoken with eyes cast downward. The Caldwells lived in a swampy, isolated stretch of land miles from Bellone, a property surrounded by mosquito-choked waters, leaning cypress trees, and suffocating vegetation. Locals rarely visited, not because they were unwelcome, but because the terrain itself repelled outsiders. Devil's Swamp, they called it. The name had been passed down for generations, long before Margaret Caldwell and her grandson Elijah made it their prison. Margaret was 58 years old in 1962. The family matriarch, whose sharp eyes and rigid demeanor had long warned strangers to keep their distance. She had been widowed for more than 2 decades, raising her children and later her grandchildren alone in a house that seemed untouched by modern life. Electricity had never reached the swamp property, and Margaret had never sought it. She preferred kerosene lamps, hand-dug wells, and the kind of silence that only comes from being utterly cut off from the world. Living with her was Elijah Caldwell, her grandson, a man of 27 who had returned to the swamp 5 years earlier after his parents were killed in a tragic car accident. By all accounts, Elijah had once attempted to leave. Parish records show that as a teenager he traveled to Memphis, Tennessee in search of work and independence. But Memphis did not embrace him. Elijah was described by townsfolk as a peculiar boy, withdrawn, slow to speak, quick to anger, never quite fitting into the rhythm of the world around him. In Memphis he found only rejection. By 1957, after his parents' death, he had nowhere to go but back to Devil's Swamp. For years their lives remained largely invisible to the outside community. When they ventured into Bellone, it was only for supplies, flour, salt, canned goods, medicine. Margaret's stern face kept questions at bay, and Elijah's nervous glances kept people from lingering too long in conversation. Martha Jenkins, the owner of the town's only grocery store, recalled later how she often felt a strange unease when the Caldwells came to buy provisions. They looked like they carried a shadow with them, she told investigators decades later, as if they feared someone might discover something they didn't want known. The storm finally broke in October of 1962, when Margaret appeared at the county hospital to deliver a child. For a woman of nearly 60, pregnancy itself was extraordinary, almost impossible. But the true shock came when she refused to name the father, refused to explain, refused to answer any question the doctors posed. Nurses whispered in the corridors, their faces pale with unease. The physician, Dr. Howard Reynolds, later admitted that from the moment he saw the child, he knew something terrible was unfolding. The newborn bore grave deformities, a distorted skull, fused fingers, and a cleft palate that made feeding almost impossible. Dr. Reynolds recorded everything in a confidential medical report. He noted the mother's advanced age, her hostility toward questioning, and the severe congenital defects of the child. The report was filed away, sealed, and forgotten until decades later it would resurface to confirm what the community eventually learned in whispers and newspaper clippings. Meanwhile, Sheriff James Wilson quietly opened a discreet investigation. He had received too many strange reports from local screams echoing from the swamp, children's shapes glimpsed in the shadows, odd behaviors that made little sense. Wilson assigned Deputy Robert Thompson, a young and diligent officer, to keep watch on the Caldwell property. What I found there, Thompson later wrote in his private diary, was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in my life. On his visits he observed not only Margaret and Elijah, but 3 other children who lived with them. All three bore deformities similar to the infant Margaret had delivered. They struggled with movement, rarely spoke, and carried facial features that spoke of deep genetic disorder. It was as though the bloodline itself was collapsing in on itself. Still, Thompson had little proof. He could not accuse without evidence. His notes would remain locked in his desk until his death in 1998, when his family discovered the diary and turned it over to archivists. The breaking point came in January of 1963, when one of the Caldwell children, 5 years old, frail, coughing with fever, was brought to the hospital with severe pneumonia. The medical staff. To understand the Caldwell case, one must rewind to 1957, when Elijah first returned home after the accident that killed his parents. He was 22 then, a man adrift in the world, unable to belong anywhere else. Reverend Thomas Williams, the local preacher, told investigators years later that Elijah was a strange, withdrawn boy. When he came back after his parents' death, it was like he'd lost what little connection he had to the outside world. Margaret treated him like a child again, not a grown man. What happened in the isolation of Devil's Swamp between Margaret and Elijah remains partly a mystery. Some speculate Margaret, hardened by loneliness and loss, twisted her grief into something monstrous. Others argue Elijah, weak and dependent, was molded by her dominance until he could not resist or escape. The geography itself played a role. Devil's Swamp was not just a place, it was a trap. The single dirt road that led to the Caldwell property often disappeared under water during rainy seasons, cutting off access for months. No visitors came. No neighbors stopped by. And inside the walls of that decaying farmhouse, whatever happened was hidden from the eyes of the world. By the time social worker Jean Roberts arrived on the property in 1963, the damage was irreversible. Her report described the Caldwell home as a museum of horrors frozen in time. The walls were covered in rotting newspaper clippings used as insulation. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no sanitation. Children slept on moldy mattresses. Rats nested in the kitchen. The smell of decay clung to every surface. But the greatest horror was not the house, it was the family itself. Comment below what you think about this case so far. Would you have believed the rumors if you were living in Bologna in 1962? Or would you, like so many others, have dismissed them as swamp gossip? The Caldwell revelation struck Bologna like lightning. Whispers that once lingered in the corners of grocery stores and church pews burst into open scandal. The sheriff's office, the county hospital, even the parish clergy were suddenly entangled in a web of horror they had never imagined. The people of Bologna asked themselves, how long had this gone on? How could the law, the church, the neighbors have turned blind eyes for so many years? Sheriff James Wilson, a man respected for his calm hand and steady judgment, found himself at the center of a nightmare. He had suspected strange happenings in Devil's Swamp, but the truth exceeded his darkest fears. He called a closed meeting with state officials, doctors, and social workers to decide what must be done. Deputy Robert Thompson's surveillance notes became the foundation of the case. His diary, though private at the time, confirmed what medical staff had already concluded. The children's deformities, their silence, their struggles to walk or speak, were clear signs of incest. The first official step was the removal of the children from the Caldwell property. On a cold morning in February 1963, Sheriff Wilson, accompanied by Jean Roberts, the young social worker assigned to the case, drove into Devil's Swamp with 2 patrol cars and a medical team. The journey itself was arduous. Mud swallowed tires, branches clawed at the cars, and the thick air felt suffocating. Wilson later wrote in his memoirs that driving into that swamp was like descending into another world, one where the rules of civilization no longer applied. When they arrived, Margaret stood defiantly on the porch, her arms crossed, her face unmoved. Elijah lingered in the shadows, silent, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. The children clung to the edges of the house, wide-eyed and trembling. Roberts recalled the moment in vivid detail. The house smelled of damp wood, mold, and unwashed bodies. The children looked more like ghosts than the living. They didn't understand why strangers were there. They didn't understand what life outside that swamp could be. Margaret refused to cooperate. She argued, cursed, and at one point even threatened to curse those who would take her babies. Elijah said nothing, he simply stood behind her, his expression blank. Ultimately, force was not needed. The children, weak and sickly, allowed themselves to be carried into the waiting cars. The removal sparked fury among some locals who distrusted government interference, but for most in Boulogne, it was a relief. Rumors had turned into reality, and reality was uglier than anyone had dared imagine. Once in state custody, the children underwent extensive medical examinations. Doctors confirmed the worst: multiple congenital deformities, cognitive impairments, and signs of malnutrition. Some of the children struggled with basic motor skills. Others had never spoken a word. Their genetic conditions were consistent with inbreeding. For years, the Caldwell case remained hidden in locked archives. Margaret was quietly committed to a state hospital for the insane. Elijah, declared unfit to stand trial, was sent to a mental institution. The children were placed in foster care, though many would live short lives due to their conditions. Yet silence could not erase memory. Among locals, the story lingered like a ghost in the swamp. Hunters who wandered near Devil's Swamp swore they heard children's cries in the distance, even after the house had been abandoned. Fishermen told of seeing lights flicker in the windows of the rotting Caldwell home. The legend grew, part fact, part myth, but always rooted in the same disturbing truth. A grandmother and her grandson had borne children together in that isolated place. Deputy Thompson, who lived with the memory for decades, once confessed to a friend that he dreamed of the Caldwell children until his dying day. "I see their eyes," he said, "big, dark, empty eyes, like they were asking me why nobody saved them sooner." The haunting nature of the case reached beyond Boulogne. In the 1970s, when confidential state records briefly surfaced during a review of old cases, scholars of sociology and psychology began citing the Caldwell family as an extreme example of isolation and generational decay. They argued that Devil's Swamp created a perfect storm: geographic isolation, psychological dependency, and the erosion of social norms that allowed such an atrocity to occur. By the 1980s, Mississippi newspapers began cautiously referencing an infamous family scandal in Humphreys County, though names were often withheld. Only in the late 1990s, after Deputy Thompson's diary was discovered, did the details fully emerge. His writings painted a picture darker than official reports. He described nights when he sat in his patrol car, watching the house from a distance, hearing faint wails and strange laughter drift across the water. He wrote of Margaret's cold stare, of Elijah's nervous fidgeting, of children who moved with jerky, unnatural motions. When the diary was published in a small historical journal, the Caldwell scandal was finally unveiled to the wider public. True crime enthusiasts, historians, and journalists alike were horrified. Some doubted the details, arguing that Thompson exaggerated or that decades of gossip had warped the truth. But the hospital records, the social worker reports, and the testimony of those still alive confirmed the essence of the story. The house itself became a symbol of the tragedy. Abandoned after Margaret and Elijah were taken away, it slowly rotted into the swamp. Walls collapsed. Vines swallowed the porch. By the 2000s, little remained but a skeletal frame. Locals called it cursed, and few dared to approach. Yet the memory of what had happened there kept it alive in whispers. Even today, when the subject arises in Boulogne, older residents grow quiet. Some shake their heads, muttering about the devil's work. Others insist it was human weakness, not supernatural evil, that allowed such horrors. The Caldwell case is more than a grotesque story of incest. It is a cautionary tale about isolation, secrecy, and the dangerous power of silence. Had neighbors spoken louder, had authorities pressed harder, had someone dared to pierce the veil of Devil's Swamp sooner, perhaps the children might have been spared. But they were not. And so the story lingers, heavy as the Mississippi air, impossible to fully bury. Comment below, do you believe Margaret was the manipulator and Elijah the victim? Or do you think they were equally responsible for the horrors of Devil's Swamp? By the time the 1970s arrived, the Caldwell scandal had faded from public attention, yet its shadow lingered over Boulogne. The swamp reclaimed the property slowly. the house decaying into nothing more than a skeletal ruin of wood and moss. But the memory of what had happened there refused to disappear. Among those who lived through it, it was a story that never left the mind, a scar etched into the town itself. Occasionally, hunters and fishermen would pass near Devil's Swamp, claiming to hear sounds: children crying, a woman's voice shouting, footsteps in the reeds. Most dismissed these reports as folklore, exaggeration, or the eerie sounds of wildlife. Yet the accounts persisted, creating an almost mythical aura around the abandoned Caldwell property. For those who knew the truth, these stories were less myth and more echo of human suffering, a reminder that the horror had once walked through those walls. In 1978, a journalist from Jackson, Mississippi, began investigating old files on rural family tragedies and stumbled upon references to the Caldwell case. The state had long buried the records. Hospital documents, deputy diaries, and social worker reports were sealed under decades of privacy protections. But this journalist, persistent and meticulous, pieced together fragments from public records, court documents, and interviews with surviving locals. The picture that emerged was so grotesque it stunned even the seasoned reporter. By the early 1980s, copies of Deputy Thompson's diary circulated quietly among scholars of psychology and sociology. Thompson had detailed in painstaking entries every visit to the Caldwell property, every observation of the children, and every interaction with Margaret and Elijah. What made the diary chilling was its tone, matter-of-fact, clinical, yet suffused with disbelief and horror. He recorded nights when screams echoed across the swamp, days when he observed the children barely able to feed themselves, and the eerie calm with which Margaret accepted the unnatural circumstances she had created. The diary revealed something previously unknown. Elijah, while undoubtedly a victim of his grandmother's dominance, had also been complicit. He participated in daily life on the property with a strange mixture of fear and resignation, reinforcing Margaret's control. Thompson's words painted a portrait of a man trapped by circumstance, isolated from the world, yet capable of choices that furthered the horror. Social workers who later examined the children confirmed severe psychological damage. Even after removal from the swamp, the children exhibit extreme attachment disorders, difficulty forming bonds, and delayed speech. Some developed. Meanwhile, Margaret and Elijah's fates diverged in the institutional system. Margaret remained in a state psychiatric hospital, her mental state oscillating between lucidity and detachment. Staff described her as calm, often reflecting on her life with a chilling absence of emotion, recounting the events with the same tone used to discuss the weather. Elijah, considered mentally unfit for trial, was placed in a separate facility where he lived under supervision for the remainder of his life. Reports indicate he was obedient but quiet, rarely interacting with other patients or staff, his gaze often fixed on some distant memory of Devil's Swamp. Over time, historians and true crime writers began referencing the Caldwell case as an example of the extreme consequences of familial isolation. In textbooks and journals, the case illustrated how isolation, secrecy, and unchecked dominance could create cycles of abuse and genetic calamity. Scholars debated whether Margaret was purely manipulative, Elijah purely a victim, or if both had played roles in perpetuating the nightmare. By the 1990s, the story began to emerge publicly in small, cautious articles. Local newspapers referred to Mississippi's darkest family secret, often with sanitized descriptions, careful to avoid sensationalism. Yet the public could sense the weight of what had happened. The combination of advanced maternal age, incestuous relationships, and the grotesque conditions of the children fascinated and horrified readers. The story became a case study in the failure of social oversight, the dangers of isolation, and the extremes of human behavior. In 1998, the discovery of Deputy Thompson's diary fully reopened the case to historians and journalists. The diary corroborated earlier reports and revealed intimate details about daily life in the Caldwell home. Thompson had written about observing Margaret instructing Elijah in ways that blurred the line between authority and control, often using fear to maintain dominance. He recorded the children's reactions, noting their vacant stares, jerky movements, and hesitance to engage with outsiders. For many, the diary confirmed what they had long suspected. The horror of Devil's Swamp was not merely the result of genetics, but the deliberate cultivation of control, manipulation, and secrecy. Margaret had created a system in which her grandson was both enforcer and victim, a childlike adult molded into her shadow. The children were the tragic byproducts of this system, innocent yet irrevocably harmed by circumstances beyond their control. The legacy of Devil's Swamp extended beyond the immediate family. Bologna, once a sleepy town, now carried the weight of national infamy. For decades, residents avoided the topic, but the story persisted in local memory. Some refused to sell land near the swamp, believing it cursed. Others claimed that even decades later, they could sense a lingering presence in the thick moss and stagnant waters, a reminder that evil, once allowed to take root, leaves marks that endure long after the perpetrators are gone. For historians, the Caldwell case has become a grim reminder of the power of silence. Had neighbors questioned? Had authorities acted sooner? Had social workers been more proactive, the suffering of the children might have been mitigated. Instead, geography, secrecy, and human fear allowed the family to exist in isolation, unmonitored and unchallenged. The swamp itself acted as a shield, both literally and metaphorically, protecting generations of abuse until the truth could no longer be hidden. By the early 2000s, Devil's Swamp had become a subject of fascination for urban explorers and true crime enthusiasts. Photographs of the property, taken by those daring enough to approach the ruins, circulated online and in magazines. Even in decay, the house inspired fear. Its walls, now collapsing, were still covered in remnants of old newspaper, a silent testimony to the lives once contained within. People who visited reported an oppressive feeling, a heaviness in the air, as if the swamp itself mourned the tragedies it had witnessed. The story of Margaret and Elijah Caldwell remains a cautionary tale about the extremes of human behavior when isolation and secrecy intersect. It is a reminder that evil does not always shout, it sometimes whispers, hiding behind closed doors in places society rarely reaches. The swamp, the house, the children, and their tragic fate serve as a dark mirror to the consequences of neglect, fear, and moral failure. Comment below. Do you think the isolation of Devil's Swamp was the key factor in this tragedy? Could this horror have occurred in a more connected community, or was geography only part of the story? By the 2000s, the Caldwell case had evolved into something more than history. It had become legend. Devil's Swamp, with its decaying house and dense, choking vegetation, was a symbol of what happens when human cruelty is left unchecked. The story of Margaret and Elijah Caldwell was studied in sociology and psychology classes, dissected by true crime authors and recounted by locals in hushed tones. Yet despite all the documentation, the emotional weight of the case remained impossible to measure. Margaret Caldwell spent the rest of her life in the state psychiatric hospital. Records indicate she aged quietly, her body frail but her mind often eerily lucid. Staff reported that she would speak matter-of-factly about her children, describing the births, the deformities, and her role in their lives as though recounting ordinary events. There was no repentance, no visible remorse. Those who encountered her described a chilling detachment, a woman who had long since removed herself from conventional morality and the judgment of others. Elijah's life followed a different path, but no less tragic. In the institution, he remained withdrawn and silent. Though technically free from Margaret's immediate control, he was still psychologically trapped by decades of isolation and manipulation. He rarely spoke, avoided interaction with staff or other patients, and seemed to exist in a perpetual haze of memory. Psychologists who evaluated him concluded that his ability to form independent, moral judgment had been compromised by the unique environment of Devil's Swamp, leaving him dependent on Margaret in ways both subtle and profound. The surviving children, those fortunate enough to be removed from the swamp, before further damage occurred, faced lives of struggle. Many had permanent physical deformities and developmental delays caused by the incestuous relationship and neglect. Even in foster care, they struggled to adapt to society, haunted by memories they could not articulate and the subtle but persistent imprint of genetic and psychological trauma. Social workers later noted that despite decades of therapy and medical care, the psychological effects of growing up in the swamp were never fully erased. Over time, researchers sought to understand how such a tragedy could occur. Sociologists examined the combination of isolation, fear, and secrecy that allowed Margaret and Elijah to continue their relationship unchecked. They studied the geography of Devil's Swamp, the submerged roads, the impassable terrain, the way isolation insulated the family from legal and social oversight. Some argued that without such physical isolation, the abuse might have been detected much earlier. Others emphasized the role of social apathy, noting that small communities sometimes avoid intervention in what they consider private family matters, even when signs of abuse are evident. Yet geography alone was not the full story. Margaret's psychological dominance and Elijah's dependency created a cycle that was nearly impossible to break. Observers noted that Margaret's manipulation extended beyond coercion. She had isolated Elijah emotionally, socially, and mentally. In many ways, the swamp itself became an extension of her control, a barrier that kept both her and Elijah trapped in a system they had created together. The abandoned Caldwell house became a magnet for curiosity and fear. Local teenagers dared each other to approach the ruins, often returning pale-faced, claiming to hear whispers, soft footsteps, and cries that carried across the swamp. Photographers and urban explorers documented the collapsing structure, its walls covered in rotting newspapers, its rooms strewn with debris. Even in decay, the house seemed to exude the memories of what had occurred inside. For those who knew the story, Devil's Swamp was more than an abandoned property. It was a repository of human suffering. In scholarly circles, the Caldwell case became a landmark study of extreme familial dysfunction and manipulation as a rare but powerful formula for generational trauma. Historians cited the case as evidence of the failures of social oversight in rural communities during the mid-20th century, and true crime enthusiasts, drawn to the shocking details, kept the story alive in forums, podcasts, and documentaries, ensuring that Margaret and Elijah's crimes would never be forgotten. Even decades later, Baloney carries the mark of the Caldwell family. Residents rarely speak of Devil's Swamp openly. When the subject arises, they often do so in whispers, careful to convey both horror and reverence for the tragedy that once unfolded there. The swamp has reclaimed much of the land, hiding the ruins under thick vines and stagnant water, but the memory endures, a cautionary tale of what can happen when isolation, secrecy, and human cruelty intersect. The story of Margaret and Elijah Caldwell is not just a tale of perverse relationships. It is a story about the fragility of human oversight, the consequences of neglect, and the dark potential that lies within families when accountability is absent. It reminds us that evil can exist quietly, unobserved, and that silence, fear, and isolation can create conditions where horror flourishes unchecked. In the end, the Caldwell tragedy is a testament to the enduring impact of trauma, both physical and psychological. The children who survived carry scars that will never fully heal. Elijah and Margaret's lives serve as a study in manipulation, control, and moral corruption. And Devil's Swamp stands as a silent witness, a place where history refuses to forget the darkest secrets of one family and the town that watched in silence. Comment below. Could the Caldwell tragedy have been prevented? Or was it inevitable given the isolation and secrecy of Devil's Swamp? How should society respond when such cases emerge today? Thank you for watching. If you found this story